In this video, I'm going to show you how to structure a PowerPoint presentation based on your research. Let's do it. Hey everyone, welcome to this video. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to structure a PowerPoint presentation based on the research that you've done, based on your thesis, based on your dissertation. I'm going to give you a few important principles to consider before you start, and then give you a few practical tips that you need to consider, and then I'll end off with an example of a PowerPoint presentation that you can use as a template. Let's get straight into it. So maybe you finished your PhD or your master's thesis and now you need to present it to a panel of academics or professors, and you are wondering how to structure the PowerPoint presentation. This video will help you. At the outset, what is important to understand is that the PowerPoint is not your thesis. You are not meant to regurgitate the thesis. Rather, the intention is to provide a summary of the main findings in the thesis and be as informative as possible with as little information as possible. The thesis remains the go-to document. If the panel that is listening to your presentation wants more details, they can consult the actual thesis document itself. So you need to be as selective as possible with the information you put in the PowerPoint presentation in order to showcase the main thrust of your thesis. So you must present this in a succinct and focused manner. This is, however, a difficult balancing act because the natural tendency is to want to showcase too much information. So if we liken it to a movie, for example, the PowerPoint presentation must not be like the trailer for a movie, but like a highlights reel of the movie, because you get the highlights of the entire movie as well as the storyline and the resolution, or in the case of your thesis, you addressing the problem and providing recommendations or your findings. A trailer, on the other hand, teases the moviegoer. It creates excitement for the movie, but it provides no indication of the resolution. Your PowerPoint presentation, however, must provide the resolution to enable the listener to get a very good idea of what your thesis was about, what the problem was, what the literature says on this topic, what methods you used, what your main findings were, how you solved the problem or did not solve the problem, and what your recommendations and conclusion is. So in effect, the PowerPoint presentation takes the highlights of your entire thesis and should focus on the story, the process that you adopted, and the main contribution ultimately at the end of your research. From a practical point of view, let me give you a few tips that will help you with the structure. Firstly, keep the audience in mind. In other words, the style that you adopt must reflect the expertise of the audience. Academics tend to be a lot more clinical in terms of the expectations of the PowerPoint presentation and dislike bells and whistles. In general, in the economic and management sciences disciplines, we tend to be a bit more conservative. Get to the point. Don't beat around the bush. Don't be too abstract. Say it like it is. Secondly, keep the PowerPoint neat. No grammatical errors, no spelling errors. Keep the alignment of the paragraphs consistent. Keep the alignment of the bullets consistent. Which brings us to the third tip. Use bullets. If you are using, for example, square bullets, make sure that all the bullets in a particular slide use the square bullets. If you indent a bullet, use a different type of bullet. Maybe the circle. Just be consistent. This follows that the fourth tip is be consistent in the style design of all the slides in the presentation. Make sure the headings are consistent in terms of font size and also in terms of the formatting. You don't want a situation where you have one slide with a certain size font for a heading and then the next slide has got a totally different font size, maybe even a different type of font. Be consistent from slide 1 right till your final slide. Tip number 5, which I find very useful, in your literature review slides, as far as possible, ensure that there is a citation at the end of each bullet, or at the very least at the end of each idea from a particular source. The next tip is to preferably use short sentences, if not keywords, rather than long sentences. Now, I'm not saying don't use long sentences. They do have their place in certain places in the presentation. But remember, the important thing is that you do not want to regurgitate the thesis on the PowerPoint presentation. Do not cut and paste sentences unless it is vitally important from your Word or PDF document, unless you want to make an explicit point, or unless you cannot say it in a better way. If you use direct quotes, ensure that you put a page number with a citation. Remember that what you are also trying to do in this presentation is to show the panel that you are able to summarize the main findings, the main highlights of your thesis. And by just cutting and pasting directly from the thesis itself does not show your ability to extract the highlights from your study. The next important tip: if you do have tables or figures or diagrams that you would want to put in the presentation, rather renumber them as opposed to keeping their numbers according to the document itself. Once again, remember, although the PowerPoint is based on your thesis, it is for all intents and purposes something on its own. Another great tip that has reduced a lot of stress in my career is to convert the PowerPoint presentation to a PDF document and have both the PDF and the PowerPoint presentation as options when you present. I've had situations where I enter a lecture hall or I enter a conference and I open my PowerPoint presentation only for all the fonts and all the alignment to be a total mess. By converting the PowerPoint to a PDF document, you will avoid this. I would even go as far as emailing both to your personal email address, so that if your memory stick is not read by the computer that you are working on, that you are able to access the presentation by accessing your emails. Another useful tip is to work on approximately 1 minute per slide. This is just a rough guide, but generally speaking, if I have to make a presentation of 20 minutes, I have about 20 slides, give or take 1 or 2. On the one hand, you don't want to have too few slides because you might not utilize all the time you have, and on the other, you might have too many slides and end up not getting through all of them. But this is just a rough guideline. It also depends on the content that you're presenting, but is useful especially the first couple of times that you present. The most important tip, however, try and do some recon on the venue itself. Try and test the computer that you're going to be working on. Get a feel for the size of the venue, how many people might be sitting and watching you, how your voice sounds. Of course, when the venue is full of people, it's going to sound different, but just get a feel for it. There might even be some guidelines with regards to the presentation itself. Do some work beforehand, therefore, to get a feel for what is needed. And this will reduce the stress levels and put you at ease leading up to making the presentation. Finally, before we do the example, I should also say that you need to be guided, especially if you are making a presentation in a university context based on your research, by the rules and guidelines and expectations of the faculty or the department within which the presentation is being made. What I'm presenting to you might not apply in all contexts, so be sure to find out if there are specific requirements that you need to adhere to. On that note, let's do an example. So as you can see in front of you, I've got a presentation based on a master's study done by a student of mine a few years ago. The topic is the environmental risks and lending processes in Namibian banks. You can see that I have my university logo. It was a presentation made in the name of the university, so I had to include the logo. It indicates the name of my department as well as the department where the student did his thesis in. I was his supervisor, hence both of our names. As I indicated to you in the tips, what I like doing is making a PDF document of my PowerPoint presentation. So we can just go save as, and then instead of indicating a PowerPoint, you select the PDF and then you save it as a PDF. So here I've opened up the presentation in a PDF format, and I'm going to be using that today. You'll see the first page over here. I've got all the details as I indicate on the PowerPoint itself. If you just scroll down to the next page, it acts like you are scrolling down to the next slide itself. The next slide I have is the agenda slide, or the table of contents, you can call it that. And the intention of this slide is to create an awareness with the audience as to what your presentation is going to be about, what the content is, give them a broad overview of what to expect. So I've indicated the background and the objective of the paper. We'll do the literature review following that, the methods I adopted, the main findings, and I've identified 4 main categories, the managerial implications and recommendations, and then the conclusions. You can also include a reference list at the end. Some universities require you to put a reference list in, so make sure that you find out once again what is required from the respective university. So this study goes about environmental risks that banks in Namibia are faced with, but the challenge is the disclosure of these risks. Without going into too much detail in this video, this background provides a context where the panel can get a good feel of the environment within which these banks operate. So I talk a bit about the banks and the challenges they face from an economic point of view. I indicate how mining and agricultural industries contribute to degradation within the actual economy. I also talk about the Ministry of Environment and Tourism and how they've cautioned these particular banks and companies in general with regards to the environmental risks. And then I mention some legislation that has been put in place by the particular government in Namibia. So the intention of the background is to introduce the panel and set the scene for what is coming. Now, in a presentation of 10 minutes or 15 minutes, you can't spend too much time on the background because you've got to get to the really important stuff. So have enough in terms of the background. You'll notice that I call it the background, the heading itself. I've been consistent in the font size. I've also kept the bullets consistently aligned below each other over there. Right, there's no bullet that is indented too much to the left or too much to the right. They are aligned and it looks neat. In terms of the problem statement, as I've mentioned in another video on the problem statement, which you can click on the link on top, problem statement should have 2 parts, what the problem is and what the implications are of not addressing the problem. So the first part of the problem is I highlight that there is no literature in the Namibian context on this topic of environmental risk management. I also then say that where there is literature, it's predominantly in developed economies as opposed to developing or emerging markets like Namibia. Of the 84 banks that have adopted official risk management frameworks, according to the Qualitative principles, only 11% of them are from Africa. And these are predominantly banks in South Africa as opposed to Namibia. So the problem here is that we cannot comprehend or assess the extent to which these Namibian banks actually abide to environmental risk frameworks. The next slide talks about the objective of the paper. You'll notice that I've center aligned the objective. I've only got one objective. Now keep in mind that this is a research paper. It's based on a research paper as opposed to a thesis. In the thesis, you will probably have objectives of the study, and you will have a primary objective, and you might have a few secondary objectives. Once again, find out from the respective university what is required in terms of the general style and format of the document. Remember also that your primary objective should be aligned to the title of your presentation and the study itself. So the primary objective here is to investigate the environmental risk management approaches adopted in the lending processes of Namibian banks. I then get to the literature review. What you'll notice here is a few things. Without getting into the actual content itself, I give the heading literature review. I also give an indication of how many slides there are in the literature review, 1 of 5. It's important to create an expectation in your audience, so they know that in terms of the literature review, there'll be 5 slides. This is the first slide, and this creates a timing issue, which I feel is much better to keep the attention of your audience. You'll notice also at the end of every bullet, I include a particular source. Me personally, my style, I like making the source in a smaller font because I feel the bullet itself and the information on the slide should focus on what is being said as opposed to who is saying it. That doesn't mean Who is saying it is not important. You do cover yourself. You do provide the source from where your literature is taken from. But in my personal opinion, the focus should be on what is being said as opposed to who said it. I do this consistently throughout my literature review. You'll also notice that my style is to highlight important words or phrases in particular sentences that when I talk, I focus on these words. In this case, you can see I made them bold. Make sure that when you provide your sources, you have some chronological order. You can see here that I indicated from 2010, 2007, 5, and 2000. The next slide, slide 2 of 5, you'll notice in this case here, I did not make the source in a smaller font, and that's because I didn't allow it in terms of this bullet itself. The previous slide, the bullets themselves didn't have sub-bullets, whereas this slide over here has sub-bullets or numbering that follows. So I decided to keep it at a larger font. But generally speaking, I would recommend making the sources or the citations in a font that is smaller than your actual content that you are trying to portray. The next slide, slide 3 of 5, once again you can see that I've given, in this case now, 5 bullets. All the bullets are aligned. The sources are in smaller font at the end of each particular sentence. I've also highlighted a few words or phrases in bold so that I know while I'm presenting that I should focus on those keywords. It's more to guide me and also for the audience to get a feel for what I regard as being important that each respective source has highlighted. The next slide, slide 4 of 5, you can see there's more information on this slide with regards to literature. One thing that I also recommend that you do is avoid putting full stops at the end of sentences. In a PowerPoint presentation, this is normally the expected protocol. The final literature slide, you can see I've indicated 5 of 5. So the audience knows now that this is the last literature review slide. They are guided in terms of that. So what they expect going forward is the methods section. You will also notice that I'm consistent in terms of the sub-bullets. I use a dash over here, and the main bullet is a circle, which is consistent in all the slides. You'll notice that. So be consistent. It looks very unprofessional if your formatting is not consistent. So please work on this and make sure that every slide follows the same guidelines. The next slide is the research methods. This was a qualitative research design. I indicate what my technique was. I had interviews, I had open-ended questions, I interviewed key informants, or key informants were interviewed. There were 9 licensed commercial banks. And then what I did was I just gave a bit of context in terms of why qualitative research is important, just so that the panel understands that I understand the merits of a qualitative research design as opposed to a quantitative research design. You'll also see that I'm still using the circles and the sub-bullets are dashes, and I'm consistent throughout the presentation. Then I get to the findings. You'll see that the findings are 6 slides. This is the first slide. I've identified a category which has 2 slides coming. So the audience knows exactly there will be 6 finding slides, and the first 2 of these slides will be general approaches to environmental risk management by banks. So once again, I'm guiding the audience. They know what to expect. They have a feel for what's to come. You'll also see that once again, the main bullet is a circle, the sub-bullets are dashes, and the fonts are consistent, and the font sizes are consistent. You'll notice, for example, that I might have a 24 font for the main point, and the sub-fonts might have an 18 font. Now, I would suggest making the sub-bullets a slightly different font because you want to indicate that it is a sub-idea, a sub-bullet of the main idea. So that's one way of highlighting that. Also ensure that the sub-bullets are indented, as you can see over here. The next slide then, slide 2 of 6 in terms of my findings, and the second slide of the general approaches to environmental risk and management by banks. So I have a qualitative study here, so you would expect direct quotations. You can see here that I indicated one participant said the following. Here I've got my quotation marks. So this is a verbatim quotation of what this participant actually said. Make sure you have the quotation marks. The next bullet is another participant. In this case, I did not give a direct quotation, but I paraphrased what they said and got the gist of what the particular participant said. The third participant, or the third main bullet, circle bullet, as I mentioned before, I again paraphrase and get the gist of what they said. If you are doing a quantitative study, what you will have instead of direct quotes are tables with data on them. Now, you are welcome to put the tables themselves on the presentation. As I mentioned in the tips, what I would strongly suggest is that you renumber every table or figure or diagram sequentially as the PowerPoint presentation progresses. And in terms of the figures that you put, don't put too much emphasis on the figures necessarily. What you want to extract in a quantitative research design and the PowerPoint presentation is that you want to show the figures, but you want to highlight what the figures say. So for example, you might have a pie chart, or you might have a table with specific percentages on. Put that there, but don't put too many. You don't want to bombard the audience. They want to see that you are extracting the main highlights of what the data is saying. And that's what I'm doing here in this qualitative research design. The participants said a lot. I'm only highlighting what I feel are the most important quotes with regards to what they are saying. The next slide, slide 3 of 6, I've got a new main idea over here. You can see that I've highlighted a few key points taken from the participants themselves. Once again, the main bullet is a circle. The sub-bullet is indented with a dash. The font is smaller, so I'm being consistent. The next slide, findings number 4, is a new category that I identified. I highlight a few observations in terms of the participants. I also indicate what one specific participant said. Again, a direct quotation. I put it in inverted commas, and the same with the next bullet. Direct quotation. What I've also done is I've put certain words in bold so that I put emphasis on certain ideas that I regard important in the context of the study. I've done that on the top here, and I've done that at the bottom here as well. The next finding slide 5 of 6. There are 2 slides in this main category. You can see over here, slide 1 of 2. So I'm constantly guiding the audience. They know exactly what is coming. There will be no surprises in terms of the next couple of slides. I again, main circle bullet, sub bullet, dash, and I indicate that the first bullet has a direct quote from the particular respondent or participant rather, and I bold certain phrases or words that I deem being important to achieve the objectives of the study. The final slide, in terms of the findings, I do the same, and everything is consistent with the previous slides. The audience also knows now that they are finished with the findings, what they expect in the next slide therefore, and I've also indicated this in the agenda of the table of contents right up front, are the managerial implications. So here, based on the findings, I extract what I regard as the most important implications for managers. In this context now, it would be for the banks themselves. So really what I tried to convey here is what the findings, what the value of the findings were rather. And then the sub-bullet here, I link it to existing literature. So in other words, it's always good to indicate that you understand how the relevance of your study adds to the existing body of knowledge. But this is not your thesis. You need to be selective in terms of what you put here. In this case, I've only highlighted one particular source for each bullet. So I've not gone overboard. Remember, the audience can always consult your thesis if they want more detail. You are highlighting the most important points or the highlights in your PowerPoint presentation. Keep that in mind as you go through the whole process. I then make specific recommendations for, in this case, banks. So I've got my 3 recommendations here, and I highlight once again in bold what I regard as being particularly important. Remember, if I highlight it in bold, there would be an expectation that while I'm talking, the focus would be on these words or these phrases. And the expectation would also be that these words and phrases add and contribute and provide clarity on the problem that your study is trying to address and the ultimate achievement of the objectives of your study. I then also make recommendations for regulatory authorities. Once again, you can see I've made the main bullets throughout the presentation, the circle bullets. One thing also, I have justify aligned the content. So that just makes it more neater. I mentioned in the tips that academics tend to be a bit more clinical. They don't like the bells and whistles. They tend not to like the bells and whistles, especially maybe in the economic and management sciences. So that doesn't mean be bland necessarily, but try and avoid being too over the top. And what you can see in front of you over here is that it's quite consistent throughout the presentation. I've got a process, a formatting style that I've used throughout, and it's quite predictable. Then I conclude. I provide 1 or 2 bullet points that I regard as being sort of ending thoughts. And the final part at the bottom here, which I like doing, my personal style, is I focus on the most important takeaway of the study. So when the audience is left with this main thought that I've highlighted in red, you know that when the questions come that follow the presentation, a lot of them will probably be on this main finding. And that's what you want. So in a sense, you're guiding the questions that are coming because you are leaving them with a thought right at the end that highlights the main contribution of your study. And the final slide then is your thank you or comments or questions slide. Now, once again, there might be a requirement to put your reference list in. This is all dependent on the respective department or faculty or university that you are doing the presentation within. So keep that in mind. End off the presentation in a way that encourages comments or questions. Ultimately, you are doing the presentation because you probably want to showcase what you've done in your research. So if you conducted a good study and you had interesting findings, you'd want to share this with your audience. Not only that, you might be examined on the topic and your main findings, of which the presentation is a part of your assessments. You want to showcase the most important parts. So that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you found value, please consider smashing that like button and subscribing to my channel. Also consider watching some of the other videos I have, and I'm sure they will help you greatly with all your research endeavors. On that note, I will see you next time.